or physical beings, it will entail that we go through difficulty and hardship. So for us to grow, for example, we have to eat food, we have to drink water, we have to digest, we have to, just being in the womb of our mothers, it begins that life process of challenging, of fighting, of trying to survive, the fight for survival. So we're fighting against all these other elements that want to exist as well. In Islamic metaphysics, they would refer to this world as the world of multiplicities. And the world of the multiplicity of wills. Basically, in summary, what that means is everything in this world wants to exist and wants to impose its existence upon everything else. So for example, if you have a tree, you put a seed in the ground, that seed wants to germinate, wants to grow into a tree. Everything wants to grow into its own perfection. So that tree wants to grow. What does that seed have to go through in order for the tree to become a tree? It has to fight with millions of other things that want to do other stuff in the same spot that the tree wants to grow as well. So there is a conflict, there's a clash of wills. The seed wants to grow, there's gravity pulling it down. It has to push the soil away. The soil wants to be there, it wants to decompose. It wants to reach its own perfection. But the seed pushes it away, it overcomes it. So it has to push away the soil, it has to push itself outside of the ground, and it has to fight to get some light. So there's a lot of elements that the seed has to fight and has to combat with in order for it to reach its perfection. And that's the nature of this world. In the spiritual world, we don't have this. Everything exists on its own, without struggling. But in this world, the nature of the world, because it's physical, and there's space that we occupy, like I'm sitting over here, I'm occupying a space. Now someone else might want to occupy the space, so they want to push me out. It's part of the wars that we go through, right? There's a country, it has a land, another country wants that land. There's a person owns a house or property, another person wants that property. They come and they rob it, they steal it, they drive them out. So the nature of the physical world is one that clash naturally happens. Struggle naturally happens. I need to work in order to get food so that I can eat. In order to eat, I have to open my mouth. I have to chew. I have to fight viruses. I have to fight bacteria. So this is an existential issue. And it's separate from the idea of God wanting to test us or wanting to put us through struggles in order for us to become better people. This is a separate issue. So the nature of this world involves struggle, involves difficulty because of the physical properties that it has. Now, again, if we were in the spiritual world, we won't go through this kind of thing. Now, why are we put in the physical world? That's another topic. But part of it is because you cannot be tested unless you are in the physical world. If you're in the spiritual world, that kind of testing cannot happen. You have to be in a world where this struggling can exist in order for you to be tested in a manner. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is when God gets involved in our life. When we claim, for example, that we are believers. Now, to claim that you're a believer means that you're a person who wants to perfect himself or herself. You're a person who wants to move closer to God by purifying your soul and purifying your spirit. How does that happen? Well, a lot of, scholars in the past were not just scholars of religion. They were scholars who had many different skills. A lot of them were alchemists, let's say, for example. A lot of them were astrologists, astronomers, mathematicians. We just had a scholar who passed away just last month, Sheikh and he was known to be a polymath. He was a scholar and expert in astronomy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, religion, obviously. He was a scholar of religion. But he had so many areas of expertise, and a lot of our scholars in the past were like that. Many famous figures, for example, you've all heard of Ibn Sina, the famous philosopher and physician. So he was a scholar of religion, he was a doctor, he was a chemist, he was an astronomer, and many other titles as well. What they used to do, let's say in alchemy, for example, in alchemy, the scholars wanted to reach the most pure of substances and elements. What's the most pure element that we have? It's gold. Gold is the purest element that we have in this world. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to make any element transform into gold. This was their objective in alchemy. Now nobody was able to achieve that, but they wanted to transform any, let's say silver, or copper, or iron, or any other element. They wanted to figure out a way where they could perfect these elements, make them reach perfection. And what that involved was it involved heat. It involved burning that element to a certain degree that you change the composition and transform it into another element. So that changed, alchemy changed into a spiritual discipline, a spiritual kind of field. So basically, if you want to reach the purest of forms spiritually, then you have to go through some sort of purification. Without purification, you cannot reach that most pure element. So the soul, when it deals with things in its life, it becomes tainted and polluted with things that make it impure. And what a person should try doing, a believer at least, is to purify himself or herself, using elements such as fire. That's in the physical world. In the spiritual world, you would use that fire also to purify yourself. You would use things to purify your spiritual ailments. So when you claim to be a believer, God will begin putting things in your path in order to start purifying you. He puts tests for you. First of all, to prove that what you're saying is actually true. And because human beings in general, we claim to want to do things, but most of the time, we speak more than we act. We say, I want to get up tomorrow and I want to change my life. I want to get up tomorrow, I'm going to start dieting. I want to lose, 40 pounds by the end of the year. Tomorrow comes, and most of the time, we either don't start the diet, or after maybe 3 or 4 days, we kind of say, you know what, who said diets are a good thing? We start doubting this stuff. We start changing that, right? You start doubting. A lot of times, we become philosophers when we want to analyze something that requires difficulty. We all become philosophers. So when it comes to religion, it's the same thing. During the Prophet's lifetime, a lot of people claim to be Muslims. A lot of people claim to be believers. But when the test and the tribulation came, they found out that they were not really believers. And it kind of exposed them. So in one sense, God wants to show you who you really are, because sometimes we need a reality check. We claim something, but we're not that thing. And sometimes we lie to ourselves. It's not only for other people to see that it's not to expose us in front of other people. It's to wake us up, because as human beings, we love to live in denial. We love to live in a state of forgetfulness, a state that we kind of imagine that we're in. We imagine that we're doing wonderful. And social media nowadays, it does a great job in portraying that fake imagination that we have. Because in Islamic spirituality, we believe that the soul has different levels, different worlds that it connects to. One of the worlds that the soul connects to is called the world of imagination. From that world, you get your imaginations, and you get more things as well. But that's another topic. We won't go into it tonight. But what happens in Islamic spirituality, they say that you shouldn't live in the world of imagination. You should go beyond that world into the world of spiritual entities, which is the highest world that you can connect with. That's where you begin connecting to the deepest levels of your soul. But being stuck in the world of imaginations makes us live in a delusional world. We think we're something that we're not. We post on Instagram and other social media platforms images about ourselves, that we're happy, that we're excited, that we're living a wonderful life. But behind that image, we might be suffering. You put a picture with your husband, your wife, or your partner, or your family, and you're smiling, you're all happy. But we all know that might not be the case. But we're all living in this way, making each other believe that these images really portray how we're actually living. So this idea of living in our world of imagination, God sometimes wants to wake us up and tell us that don't live in a delusion. If you're someone who wants to become a better person, then don't lie to yourself, because you could live in that lie for the rest of your life and never move forward. And that's what most of us do. We don't live who we really are. We don't know who we really are. We put a cover over ourselves, and we believe that that is who we are. We create a false identity, a false personality, and we believe it so much that after a while we forget that that was something we invented. We start thinking that that's who we really are. It's like someone who lies. You create a lie, and then you lie so much that you eventually believe your lie. And so this is the state that we live in as human beings. And God sometimes puts those tests in front of us in order to wake us up from that delusion that we're living in. You know, a lot of people say, I don't commit sins throughout my day. I'm a good person. I don't hurt anybody. But in reality, you could be hurting people every single day without even realizing it, because you live in that denial. Every time you do something, you always blame that other person for your behavior. You yell at someone, instead of realizing that the anger is a bad thing inside of you, you say, well, that person provoked me. Well, maybe yelling at that person makes that person, puts them in check, wakes them up from their state of sleepiness. When in reality, it was you who shouldn't have dealt with that person in that manner. But we put that fake image in front of us. We justify our mistakes. We justify our shortcomings. And God sometimes put things in our life as believers out of His mercy to wake us up from that state. Because if we live like that for the rest of our lives, we will never advance. We'll never move forward. So that kind of shatters that fake image that we have. Now, that's another category. So the first one was the existential one. By living in this world, we go through trials and tribulations and difficulties because of the nature of the physical world. The second one is that God puts trials in our lives in order to wake us up from our sleep state. Now, another objective of putting tests in our lives is, again, to purify ourselves, to move forward. If you don't struggle, we cannot move forward. Just like in school, just like in working out, just like in anything we do in our lives. If you don't struggle, you can't get what you want. So those tests that God puts in our lives is for us to struggle in order to move forward. That's another aspect. Now, a third aspect is when we as human beings put ourselves in a punishment, not that God is punishing us. So, for example, if I'm walking, and I find that I'm walking on a pathway, I'm hiking, and I find like wood, a forest area, and there's a sign that says, "Do not go into this. There's dangerous animals in there." And I say, you know what? It's not a big deal. I'm going to go in there. I've been hiking for a while. Nothing's going to happen. You go in there, dark. It becomes dark, and then you get attacked, and something happens to you. Then you start thinking, oh, is God testing me? What's going on over here? Why is this happening to me? Well, this is something that you brought upon yourself. And scholars in jurisprudence, they give examples as well. For example, they give, when it comes to the rulings about salah, for example, prayer. If you go onto a land, you trespass, a land that's not yours, and the owner does not allow you to be on that land, are you allowed to pray on that land or no? You're not allowed. Because when you pray on a land, you have to have permission of the landowner to pray. Now, what happens is if you go on that land and you want to pray Zuhr or Asr, and Maghrib time is approaching, and you only have time for 4 rakats, and you're all the way at the end of the land, so by the time you get out of the land, the time for prayer ends. Can you still pray or can you not pray? So if you leave that land, if you want to go out and pray, Maghrib time was done. You don't have enough time to leave it. So they say over here that the sin that you get for praying on that land when you're not supposed to is because of your own wrongdoing. You're the one who put yourself in that situation. Who told you to go on that land in the first place when you're not allowed to go? You had no permission to go on that land. So some of the difficulties that we have in our lives are not direct trials by God, but they are stuff that we put ourselves in, situations that we put ourselves in. You put yourself in extra debt, for example, more than what you can afford because you want to live a lavish life. You want to compete with your neighbor. You want to have a better house. So you end up spending so much money in that, you're in so much debt. Then you start suffering by living in a very depressed state. You go through difficulties and hardships and depression. Well, that's because you put yourself in that situation. It's not that God is testing you. but you drowned yourself. You went in the water and you were warned not to do that, you still did that. So that's something that you brought upon yourself, and we can't blame God for getting involved in it. Now, the second part that we should talk about is how do we react to each and every one of these? How do we deal with existential problems? That is our physical reality. How do we deal with God's testing? And how do we deal with problems that we put ourselves in? And this is something that, maybe we can have for discussion. I'll stop it here so that we can talk. And hopefully through our discussion we can deal with these issues. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Okay, so feel free to ask. I ended it early so we can have discussion. So please do ask. If you have any question, don't be shy. Put your hand up. If your voice is low, here's a microphone. I don't know if it can reach, but if you don't want to ask, have your friend ask the question on your behalf so we can have some discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So you mentioned that Salah is not accepted if the owner of the land does not give you permission.
Yeah.
So for example, if I want to go pray in the parking lot of that building, do I have to ask for the permission? Like if I'm driving and I want to do Salah, can I just stop by at any parking lot anywhere and do the Salah? Is it going to be accepted or not? Do I have to get permission for that land?
If you have to either have general permission. So if you know that the owner of that land doesn't mind, if you know that, then you don't have to ask him.
What if I do not know the owner? Like driving.
If you're not sure, then it's better not to pray there, unless you take that permission. So you can't just go on any land and pray. It has to be a land that you are sure that the owner is okay with you praying on that land. So if you go in a parking lot, most of the time, most of the businesses here don't mind that if you perform prayer on, like they have no business with you. It doesn't bother them. So in general, you're able to tell, if this business would have a problem with it, or wouldn't have a problem with it. If you go to a more, let's say, conservative state, they're not very happy with Muslims. Most likely, they wouldn't be happy with you praying on their property. So you shouldn't pray on that.
So if I want to give an example, for example, real estate agents, like when they go show houses, just an example, a vacant house, and okay, it's time for Salah. Can they pray, for example, in that vacant house?
In general, again, it goes to you. Do you think that the person would have a problem if you pray there? The owner? Who's the owner of the house? The bank?
No one knows.
If it's unknown, then it shouldn't be an issue. It shouldn't be an issue, yeah. Yes. Wa alaikum salam.
So, I know you said that you have to go through struggles in order to purify yourself. How about the struggles that end up leading to death and like tragedies? Like one of my philosophy professors was telling us about all these tragedies that happen when it wasn't really their fault. Like for example, like a house burning and there was a kid in it and the kid had to go through that torture and resulted in a tragic death. Why did he have to go through that struggle?
Okay. Did everyone hear the question, or should I repeat it in my own words? I'll change the question so I can answer whatever I want to answer. The question is related to, and correct me if I misunderstood it. The struggles that we go through. What about the struggles that lead to the death of an individual? So, an example that you gave was a child being in a house, and that house burning, and that child dying from that fire for something that he or she didn't do. You're saying, yeah. Right? So your question is trying to figure out where that fits in.
Why did God not intervene at that moment?
Okay, so in general, the first categorization that I gave in the lecture about this world involving certain properties that come with the nature of this world have nothing to do with the God element. So for example, the earth is in space, and we have gravity, and we have water, we have fire. The nature of the physical world has to have all these elements. It cannot exist in any different way. Once you have physics or a physical world, it has to involve physical elements, and these physical elements have its own system. and they're going to work their own way. And if a fire happens, there's a fire right here right now, right? Now this fire, wind can come and blow it, and it can blow on me and burn me. Now that has nothing to do with God. It's just that it happened that I was sitting in a place where there's a fire and the wind blew and it burned me. And just because the nature of the world is like this. This is something that's out of our control. We cannot change the nature of a physical world because of our perception of what evil is or what bad is. It's human perception. So the idea of having evil or having struggle or challenges or God, testing me with something, that's from the human mind. If you remove the human from it, there's nothing outside here called evil in that sense. So if you have a cat walking, and I do have a cat, I highly doubt that my cat thinks about the problem of good and evil in God. And when it comes home, and it doesn't find food in its plate, it doesn't think, is my owner a just person or not. These concepts are human inventions. We invent them. The idea of justice, the idea of good, the idea of evil. It's our perception of things and our judgment of those things. So I might think it's evil for a person to marry 4 women. Someone else might think if you go to Utah and you live amongst the Mormons, it might be a wonderful thing. It's not evil to them. So it's a human perception. Now, some things happen in this world where we perceive it as unjust. We perceive it as evil or wrong. But in reality, it has no label of such outside of our mind. And what happens to that child is an unfortunate event that happened. But existentially, you cannot change things like this from happening in general. So it happened. Now, what happens to that child after death is something that God could compensate him with. Whether it was a child or a non-child as well, even an adult that was in the house and did nothing wrong and got burnt, or those animals that are in the forest as well. In this world, things like this are bound to happen. They cannot change. This is just how the nature of a physical world is. The God element might get involved after death, where if you died in the wrong way and you were oppressed in that sense, then you will be compensated spiritually in the other realm. That's what would happen. And that's an answer in a very general sense, and I hope it covers what you were trying to ask.
So that's one thing that I want to point out. It says in the Quran, when Allah molded man from clay, He breathed His spirit into the clay, which then formed the nafs, the soul, and then the consciousness. And this is how humans to this day still think, and how their bodies, their arms, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, the veins, the blood, the streams, gush forth blood to the bones, which stay strong, which allow you to move and keep thinking and grow in strength, mentally, physically, walk, make decisions. Okay? So yes, things are bound to happen. Allah breathed into molded clay His breath, it's the nafs, and humans to this day are, because of Allah breathing into the clay, which is the nafs, alhamdulillah, to create all of this and burn fire.
Were you adding a point to the question, or I didn't quite get?
Pointing something out that you may have missed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, did you wanted to say something else?
Yeah, so I just wanted to understand something, or clarify. Are all the struggles, they're all, you said, like, God doesn't create any struggles, does He?
He doesn't
Create any struggles?
God doesn't create any struggle. He does. He does. But depending on, yeah, so some struggles are for punishing an individual. For example, if you're a disbeliever or you're a believer who transgressed in a way, but within that punishment you have mercy, you have forgiveness. Sometimes you might punish an individual not for forgiving them, but for punishing them because they hurt someone else. Sometimes He might cause struggles for you in order to perfect yourself. If you're someone who wants to walk on a spiritual path, you require trials in order to perfect yourself. So let's say I want to become someone who reaches a very high spiritual level. How do I reach that level? God has to put trials in my path. Otherwise, I'm going to stay where I am. So I have to have a test that I can go through, pass it in order to move to the next level. Just like you're in school, you have every level, you have testing, you have examinations, because you have to go through that struggle in order to advance and to move forward. So struggle, if we want to move spiritually, and the moment we intend to move spiritually is the moment where we see that more trials and tribulations start coming into our lives. Because you did that, you created that connection with God. And you've told him that I want to walk on this path. And what God does is he'll take you, and he, as a master, as a guide, he'll take your hand and he'll move you step by step without breaking you. But he'll move you step by step so that you can reach that level of perfection that he wants you to reach. So once you intend that, God gets involved and starts putting struggles in your life. Believers in general, the mere fact of believing says to God and to ourselves that we are people who don't want to live for this world only. We believe in our spirit existing, and we want to reach the heaven. We want to reach that higher level. So naturally, we're going to be hit with tribulations and trials. But that's only to perfect ourselves or to forgive our shortcomings. So by going through a tribulation here and a punishment here, God is removing a stronger and more lasting spiritual punishment in the hereafter. So there's different dynamics that God works with. It's not just black and white. Yeah. We'll take a question from the sister, and then we'll move back here. Yeah, go ahead.
How can you differentiate the difference between the world of imagination and the world of spirituality?
How can we differentiate between the world of imaginations
and spirituality
and the world that's beyond that, which is above that? This mainly involves having a spiritual guide, for example, a teacher who has lived in that world, who was able to see those. So the Prophet himself, for example, was someone who helped people realize, differentiate between what's real and what's not real, what's real and what's imaginary. A lot of the times, most of the time, what we see at the beginning of our spiritual journeys involves our imaginations. It involves it. But it's not always our imagination. Sometimes we connect to that other realm, which has some reality to it. So certain forms, certain images. So when you sleep, for example, you might have a dream, and that dream might be you tapping into the world of imagination, or the world where it's beyond the imagination. So you see images and you see forms, but they're real. And each image and each form represents something. So for example, when the Prophet was in his Mi'raj, and he saw milk, for example, and he drank that milk or that yogurt, when he woke up, that milk represented knowledge. So it is a form of imagination. It's an image, but that image was real. It represented something. That's why the Imams, when they come to dreams, they say that some dreams are real dreams. They have messages, and others have no meaning. The Prophet's dreams always have meaning. They connect to that spiritual realm. They receive messages through those different forms and images. Whereas us, for example, most of the time our dreams might come from our own imaginations, things that we've seen throughout the day. But the more we progress as believers, the more we start being connected to another realm, and we start seeing elements that we read in certain books of scholars that tell us that these are not imaginations. So, Carl Jung, for example, the famous psychologist, when he talked about the subconscious, and he went through, to many different civilizations, and he saw that a lot of them speak about the same spiritual entities, the same spiritual symbolism. And that's why he kind of thought that there's this realm of the subconscious realm where we can all tap into that. He was getting to somewhere that the religious scholars talk about. And he was trying to figure out what are the elements that are really in there, and what are the elements that only come from our own imagination, from our worldly life over here. So, in summary, I can't answer it in a very basic fashion. I just wanted to give you a few pointers where you can take and look into that if you want further detail. So, go ahead.
said like living in a delusion. Like what if like you keep lying to yourself until you believe it, and then when you realize like what you're doing is wrong, but you don't want to believe it, how do you get out of it?
So he's asking about a person living in a delusion and believing that delusion, or lying to yourself and believing that lie, and you realize that you're living a lie. How do you manage to get yourself out of that lie? That's your question? Okay. Does anyone want to share their opinion? And I mean, we can have a discussion. It doesn't have to be this way or that way. Does anyone know of someone, for example, who lived that kind of thing and kind of woke themselves up? Someone who went through difficulty, and you want to answer that? Okay.
I don't think I really have answers on observation and everything. Like, when you look at that, I think that's some kind of reality.
So he's saying that if you look at death, if you think about death coming and maybe what you're going to face after death, that might be a strong force to wake you up from the dream that you're living. Is that what you were referring to? That's one method a person could use by thinking about what a person might go through after death, and then that might be a motivating factor to wake them up. Other methods is by taking a step-by-step approach. By first of all, if you realize that you're in a sleep state, that's a very, very big step that you've taken already. So the most important thing to start with is to realize that there's something wrong. As long as you don't realize, you can't do anything about it. So if you realize you've already crossed half of the path, you know that you're going through this, so you have to start focusing on yourself inside. You have to try to understand yourself. Why are you doing this? Why are you living this life? What is it that you're seeking? Do you want attention? Do you want to be someone who is recognized by everyone around you? You want to show off, for example, in front of other people? Do you have a weakness that you want to hide, that you don't want to face in yourself? This is why you're living that lie? So you have to sit down and kind of analyze, what is the lie that I'm living, and why am I living this lie? And so you have to understand the root problem, the cause of this. And once you get that, then you start trying to fix yourself, and you take it step by step. So it needs a lot of self-reflection.
Thank you. So I know we have a lot of young people here and teens, and they might find this topic a little bit complex. And if I wanted to simplify this topic of purifying your soul and becoming a better person for your youngster, right? If I have to translate it into maybe steps, right? Things that I can do now, starting tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? Just in a simple fashion, if you will. So what kind of things they can start focusing on and doing right away so they can get into that level of, purity later in their life. So what's the next step for them? And the most important thing to start with, if you will.
Okay, thank you. He's asking for a more, to simplify what I've been saying. I guess I've been speaking in a non-simple manner. And I know I tend to do that unintentionally. I was told multiple times before I was invited, please simplify as much as you can. And I said I thought I do simplify. I was living in this fake, belief. I thought I was very simple. It turned out that they're like, no, it's simpler than that. So I guess I didn't succeed in that. So to simplify the spiritual journeying and moving towards God, without using complex and technical terms, there's a very famous hadith. Now, it's not really a hadith, but it's attributed to the Prophet, in which he says that the path towards God is equal to the amount of breaths that the human beings have. In other words, there are so many paths to God that every breath you take could be a different path to God. There's an infinite amount of ways that we can reach God and we can reach our self-discovery. So to say that there's only one way to improve ourselves and to perfect ourselves spiritually would not be a correct claim to make. But is there a general path that a person can walk on are there general guidelines that scholars have given throughout these thousands of years. There are many people of many different religions who tried giving guidelines for people that walk on the path, and they've taught other people, they've written guidelines that you have to do so and so and so and so. One of the things in Islamic spirituality, one of the paths that you can take is by going against your desires. Now, you can't do that completely overnight. So what you can do, first of all, is you can sit down and think, what kind of struggle are you having spiritually? Are you someone with, for example, anger issues? Are you someone who lies a lot? Are you someone who has a fear? You don't have courage. You have fear, and because of that fear, you end up behaving in certain ways that harm you and harm other people. So you start by looking at you as a person. What are your vices? Vices are your negative attributes. So lying, cheating, weaknesses, and being non-disciplined, for example, that's a problem as well. Someone who always wants attention, someone who is very arrogant. So you have to look at yourself, observe your behavior, write down a list of what you think could be wrong with you as a person. What are the things that you want to improve? What are the things that you want to get rid of? Because before fixing these things, you can't walk on the path. If you're someone who can't keep a secret, you're someone who always exposes secrets because you're so used to talking about secret things to other people, like you're sitting down in a gathering, and then that gathering is meant to stay between you guys, and you end up going and telling it to someone else. If you're someone who does that frequently, then God cannot give you spiritual secrets because you're not ready for that. He won't reveal to you spiritual things because you're not ready for that. So this is something that's not good. If you're someone who reveals secrets, someone who is not able to control their tongue, then you won't be able to advance on the spiritual path. So there are certain things that you have to look and find out, am I someone who is worthy of being given something by God? So pride, arrogance, and things like that, you have to get rid of them. Because if God gives you something, then you grow more proud. You grow more arrogant. And you think that you've reached a level higher than everyone else. But in spirituality, the more you advance, the more God gives you, the more humble you are. And we have a hadith where the Imam says that you won't reach perfection until you see everybody better than you. That's when you reach perfection. When you see everyone else better than your own self. So begin by listing what problems you think you have, and begin by tackling them one by one. If you have anger issues, then decide next day, anything that happens to me, even if it's something that someone did wrong to me, and I have the right to be angry, I'm not going to be angry. And just stay like that. Stay like that for a week, 2 weeks. You're going to fail. The first day, second day, you're going to get angry because it's part of you now. You have to change that habit. Habits are difficult to change, but they're changeable. So you begin seeing yourself in situations, and then that's when you start seeing God also putting you in situations. And you start seeing that God is trying to make me get rid of this habit by putting me in an anger situation. And He wouldn't have put me in it have I not had the ability to overcome it. Because God says in the Quran that He won't test you with something that you can't tolerate, more than your own capacity. So God starts helping you by putting you in situations where you might be angry. And that's where you start saying, okay, thank you, God, for putting that. Because if you don't put them in my way, how am I going to get rid of this habit? I have to practice getting rid of it. So let's say without that intention, you'll have one anger scenario in your day. With that intention, God will add 3 more. That way, your improvement becomes better and better. So start by changing. Once you overcome your anger completely, go into your other vice. Lying, for example, backbiting, revealing secrets. Every time someone tells you something, don't go and tell anyone else that thing. Even if it's not a secret. Just get yourself used to not passing along private conversations. And the more quiet you are, the more safe you are. We have a hadith where the Imam says that every person is safe until they open their mouth. Once you open your mouth, then either you say good things or you say bad things. But before that, you're safe. There's nothing bad that you can do if your mouth is closed. So silence is very important, for example. Train yourself to be silent. Train yourself not to speak everything you hear or everything you see. And so on and so forth.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
To ask
shouldn't tell. You should only tell someone that you really trust to tell them your secrets, or just don't tell them at all.
So you should only tell people who you trust,
Or don't tell them.
or don't tell anybody. Yes. But what do you do when you have to tell someone something?
You have to make sure that they'll actually not tell.
That's also a very important point. That when you do tell someone your secret, make sure it's someone who can keep it, and that's very rare, I think. And sometimes you don't find that person. Like Imam Ali, he had to go to a well and speak into a well because he couldn't find someone who he was able to trust with his words. Yeah, but it's a human thing. We have to sometimes speak out our feelings. We need to. Sometimes you don't find that person. You end up speaking to yourself or speaking to God in order to get that out.
So, how can
Do you mind if you come a bit closer? The fire is blocking your voice.
So we're always growing up and we're always taught to love all the imams, but we notice ourselves like always loving one specific imam, maybe a bit more, putting our more attention to, for example, Imam Hussein. How are we able to attribute our love to all the imams equally? For example, like Imam al-Askari or Imam al-Jawad, while still being able to give our love to all of them.
He's asking, did everyone hear that? I'll reiterate it. Asking about how do we make our love to the imams equal? Sometimes we love one imam more than the other. A lot of the scholars who are more on the spiritual side, they don't tell you to love them equally in that kind of sense. You love them equally as you don't differentiate between any of them. But it's natural that you might feel a specific attachment to one of the imams that you don't feel for the other imams. That's natural. Because every imam represents a portion or a manifestation or a reflection of the Prophet's light. The Prophet ﷺ is that light, and the imams were created from that light of the Prophet. But every imam reflects a specific portion or side of that light that the other imam has, but is not reflected outwardly. So sometimes spiritually, we feel connected to one imam more than the other imam. And if you feel that, then build that connection with that imam. Speak to that imam more, pray to that imam more, pray meaning supplication, do tawassul, pray and send the rewards to that imam, ask for your needs through that imam, and that imam could become your spiritual guide. So for example, we have Henry Corbin, a French philosopher who became affected by the Shia beliefs. He was in the 50s. He died around in the 50s. He passed away, I believe. So he used to go to Iran. He would sit down with Allama Tabatabai, and he had a lot of conversations with them, and they published those conversations as well. He was a philosopher, a mystic. He went from France. He went through a spiritual journey. He studied in Germany, and he was, into Heidegger, and then slowly he moved into a mystic called Sohrawardi, and then from that he moved into Shia mysticism. And you can buy his books online. They're very complex, but they're like the history of Islamic philosophy to try to understand how he perceived imama and wilaya and things of that sort. One time when he was in Iran, Allama Tabatabai told him, why don't you find yourself a spiritual teacher since you're so into this path? You're really attached to Sufism or Irfan. Why don't you find yourself a spiritual master? Then you can walk on the path in a better way. And Henry Corbin turned to Allama Tabatabai and he told him, a person who has Imam Mahdi doesn't need to have a spiritual guide that's less than him. He felt that he was so connected to Imam Mahdi alayhi salam. And Sayyid Tahrani, Allama Tahrani, who saw Henry Corbin multiple times, he was in those gatherings, he said that he would see Henry Corbin going to the side, isolating himself, and reciting ziyarah and dua to Imam Mahdi and crying. So he had a spiritual attachment to that Imam. And he felt that the Imam was his spiritual guide. And he was someone who, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, for example, he says that Henry Corbin had a very strong ability to discern between the imagination and the real realm. He was able to do that. Sayyid Hussein Nasr is a professor of Islamic studies in George Washington. He studied under Allama Tabatabai, and he was a translator for Corbin when they had their discussions. Because he's Iranian, he knows French, he knows Persian and English, so he was a mediator. And this is what he said about Corbin. And he narrates the story. He relates it. That when he met, he said that, I have Imam Mahdi to be my guide. So every person could have this connection with one of the Imams, or with Sayyidah Zahra alayhi salam. If you feel that you have that connection, build it and allow them to also continue guiding you and supporting you as you move on this path.
I can add a point. I think, and I believe that the best way or the simplest way to get pure in our life is to put in our mind that Allah is watching us the whole time, with every single move, with every single breath. Since we believe and we have in mind that Allah is watching us the whole time, that means we're going to be doing the good things the whole life. That's how
I think that's a good point. But I think we shouldn't, just to put a conditional thing there, or disclaimer, we shouldn't think of God as, this individual or this being that is watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake, to punish us. But we should have that loving kind of watchful thing. That, if I love someone, then I wouldn't do something that would hurt that person. And if we love God, then I wouldn't want to do something that disappoints God. Not because I'm scared that God is going to punish me, because God is a merciful and loving God. And if He does punish, it's not because He wants to hurt me or He wants to make me feel like a miserable person, but that He wants to wake me up from my sleep. He wants to kind of correct my course. Sometimes if you're moving this way, instead of going straight like a meteor in the space, heading towards Earth, you might knock it with something just to move it away or put it back in its course, correct course. So sometimes God wants to give you that little, flick or that little hit because you're moving kind of that way and you got to go back that way. So to have that perception of God being a loving God, that's how He describes Himself, as a merciful and loving God, and not as someone who's just watching over us just to judge us and put us down and to kind of have just that fear of Him. And that might reflect negatively on our spiritual path as well. Yeah, but thank you. That's a great, and they call it self-observation. Always, you observe every moment, and if you can reach that state,
That's what I meant.
that's a very high state that you can. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we'll go there, and then we'll go right. So,
How do you know the test that you're going to?
I can't hear.
How do you know the test that you're going through to better yourself and God is putting you through the test of punishment?
So how do you distinguish between a test and a punishment? Well, first of all, through self-observation. If you observe yourself, so let's say you committed something throughout the day that warranted that punishment that you deserve. So you hurt someone and you get hurt back. What they call, for example, karma for people who believe in Hinduism or more Eastern religions. Sometimes it could be from that aspect, and you would become aware of it. It might be direct. It might be something that comes after 10 years. But regardless of what it is, a believer, again, is about your perception. If you're a believer and you're someone who believes in God in that sense, even if you get a punishment, you would utilize that punishment to turn it into something good for yourself. So if that punishment comes to you, you would use that punishment as a trial to make you stand up, to become better, to purify yourself. So your perception as a God-weary person, as a mu'min, you put yourself in that condition where you start observing everything around you as being divine. And once you change that perception, then whatever it is that you're faced with, you always utilize it to improve yourself, to move forward. So whether it's a punishment or a struggle or a tribulation that you're going through, it always leads to you moving forward in that sense. So you're referring to abusive relationships between the child and the parent, you mean, or between the husband and the spouse, both of them? So is that a test, or is it something that you should run away from, or is it something that you should stay in and maybe fight and be patient with and things of that sort? Again, it's kind of related to the same answer. In any relationship, if it's abusive in a sense, you can either sever it. I mean, there's no black and white in these issues. There's always something that, I get a challenge right now. I can either take advantage of it. It's an opportunity, right? And it's not only through spirituality, even in the physical world. Right now, I might get a job offer, and because of my laziness, I reject it, or I don't reply, I lose that job. I get another job offer, it's not as good. If I take that, then I don't work any other job. If I don't take it, then I'm going to get another job offer, I might take that job. So you have like a million different ways you can take in life, right? It's your decision to, decide which path am I going to take. If I'm in a bad relationship with someone, how bad is it? Is it something that I could use to my own benefit, or is it something that I know is going to destroy me? Do I have the ability to tolerate it, or do I not have the ability to tolerate it? It's always better to take a tribulation and work with it to improve yourself spiritually, but God has always opened the door for you to get out of problems if you reach a point where it becomes destructive. So it has to go into a self-analysis. You analyze yourself, your strength, your ability, and can you make yourself grow through that, and can you make that significant other or your parents also improve their life spiritually, and then you kind of get that benefit as well from that. Are you able to do that? Is it something you want to do, or do you say, you know what, I don't want that. I don't want to reach that level. I'm not interested in it. I just want to live a life where I don't have to wake up every morning and get into a fight with my spouse. Maybe it's something wrong with me. I have anger issues and I can't fix it, and I'm not interested in fixing it. Let me find someone who can tolerate the problems that I have. That's better for me. So it all goes back to you and your perception of yourself and of the situation and how you want to deal with it. Again, in your own struggle, in your own path, in your own mindset. Does that make sense? Any questions on this side, or you have everything resolved? Also,
No problem.
Alhamdulillah. That's wonderful. Living in peace. Go ahead.
So, Sheikh, you mentioned that Allah won't take you to a comfort zone. So,
Yeah.
how do you explain individuals that go through tests or punishments, any issue in life that they lose faith, fear and complete eternal penalty they believe that they can do that? Commit suicide, or anything that is related to, just giving up.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Well, that goes up to the individual. So you won't be given a trial that you cannot handle, but whether you decide to handle it or not, that's up to you. That's your decision. And sometimes God wants you to go through certain struggles in your life. So would God sometimes cause you to lose faith? Possibly, yeah. Why? Because He wants to purify the faith that you have. So I know a friend who went through a bunch of different changes. So first of all, rejecting God, denying God because of the problem of evil. And just a week ago, which marks about, let's say, 5 years since that person left faith and religion, that person re-entered religion, but in a much deeper sense. So the struggles that they had were very shallow ones, and those were a barrier between them and reaching God and that reality because they wanted something deeper. And what they were offered, usually what's offered by theology and things like that, like the problem of evil, these things are surface level issues. And that person was looking for something deeper, and those things were barriers. So those have to be removed first. By rejecting the kind of creed and faith that you have, which came with those issues, which came with those preconceptions that you have about God, and about how God functions, the definition of God, the religion of God. You come with preconceptions, they shape your mind and your understanding about life, and that might be wrong. So God wants you to remove them. So sometimes He might cause you to become a disbeliever completely, to remove that version of belief. And then once you purify yourself, you go through certain struggles, You enter the realm of belief in a much deeper sense, in a much purer sense, not polluted or tainted with all these other pollutants. So,
One last question.
looks like the guys are going through a lot of problems. And
That's suffering.
oh yeah, we are suffering. Alhamdulillah.
So can you please speak into the importance of Salah and Siyam and those things into helping us, to again purify ourselves and get into that level. The reason I'm asking is, we know that those stuff is important and we have to do them, but yet they don't really get us there, right?
Yeah.
So there's something going wrong, right?
Yeah.
So everyone pray, most of the people,
Yeah.
but the majority are not there yet.
Yeah.
The level you're talking about.
Yeah.
So what is wrong? What's happening? It's not the Salah, of course. It's probably us. But why? What we can do to get better?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the role of prayer and fasting and things like that in religion, why they're prescribed for us, why should we do them, and how do they benefit us? And sometimes we do them so much and nothing happens. Well, religion gave prescriptions for us. The Prophet walked on a path. He reached prophecy. He reached that level of communicating with God through Gabriel. And he told us, if you want to walk on my path and reach those realities, then you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And most of those rituals and prayers and things that we have to do, they're prescriptions for spiritual illnesses to tell us how to walk, how to move. And so knowing the nature of the soul, fasting is something that detaches us, or should detach us, from our physical senses, so that we move away from the physical, the bodily, and we focus on the spiritual. That's what fasting should do. Now, we don't fast all year because of God's mercy. At the end of the day, even if we don't do good enough, God will forgive us and put us in a better place than we are. But God wants us ourselves to move towards that higher level. So He gives us prescriptions. Fasting, for example. Prayer every single day. Now, prayer and fasting and all these, they have to be coupled with another thing, which is mindfulness, which is thinking, which is tafakkur, which is meditating. If you sit down right now and pray without focusing on your prayer, then that prayer would be like the Prophet said, it's just like a movement, like a chicken moves, right? The chicken, when it pecks on the ground, the human's like pecking on the ground like that, because it's only movements without contemplation. And in our hadith, the Imams always, and the Prophet always couple these two things together. That you have to have contemplation and thinking alongside action. And sometimes, or most of the time, contemplation or meditation is much better than action itself. تَفَكُّرُ سَاعَةٍ خَيْرٌ مِنْ عِبَادَةِ سَنَةٍ. To contemplate, meditate, think for 1 hour is greater than worshiping for a whole year. Perform salat for a whole year and meditate for 1 hour. Meditation, according to hadith, or contemplation, tafakkur, is much better than that prayers of a year. That shows an important, maybe we're missing an element. How much of our day do we dedicate to meditating? And I mean this in the divine meditating sense. So basically thinking about ourselves, about our existence. And that's how much time do we dedicate every single day? We're praying, we're fasting, we're doing our obligations. But are we doing that one thing that the Prophet and Imam told us to do that is greater than a year of these? Or we're not doing it? Most of us are not doing that. We don't dedicate time in our days, in our daily schedule, to sit down and meditate. We don't. Even though we have a lot of hadith saying that it's greater than actual worship itself. Because the more you meditate, the deeper you understand yourself, the more your salat becomes a connection with yourself and God. The less you meditate, the more you become detached, busy with your senses, busy with this outside world. Your salat only becomes a movement that doesn't have much of a benefit. It does have some benefit, but not enough to create some sort of internal transformation or change.
I want to add something, then I have a question.
Okay.
Something that I wanted to add. So basically, what you're saying is that, like, as this question is like siyam, praying, and everything, all those things are physical manifestations of worship, right? And then, but what might be missing is that spiritual manifestation of worship, which could be found through meditation, contemplation, reflection, and those other things. So
should pray no matter what. But there are people who pray their whole life, but then they don't have that, the reflection and the contemplation. So maybe a prayer is not worth as much as, or like, they did good by that manifesting of promotion. However, they don't find the essence in that prayer if they don't go through that spiritual, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
Is that basically
Yes, basically that. So you have to perform these if you want to reach that level that the Prophet spoke about. But that vessel, in order, if you meditate and then you pray that specific prayer, you reach a higher level than someone who meditates and doesn't pray that specific prayer. So you both through meditation gain some insight into yourself. But that prayer is a vessel that carries you faster than other methods. The Prophet himself went to the cave of Hira, right? He meditated for 40 years of his life before he became a prophet. What makes us who are not prophets think that we don't have to go through something like this? This is a natural path that every human being has to go through. This is the nature of human beings. If you don't sit down and discover who you are, none of your actions, whether it's salat or even talking to your friend, is going to be filled with mindfulness or spirituality. It won't be. It requires for you to turn internally instead of always being focused externally. Your question? Okay, then.
As for my question, back to you.
Okay, so we're going to have just the last question here. Then we're going to wrap it up.
Just real quick, back to your topic, you said there was the realm of imagination.
Yeah.
But how many realms are there, and what are those realms?
Well, it depends on the school of philosophy that you read for. Usually they're divided into three. Usually you have the physical realm, and you have the imaginal realm, and then you have the intellectual realm. Intellect, in the traditional sense, was equal to spiritual, not the intellect not the current definition. Intellect before meant something else. So it's the physical, imaginal, intellectual, which is the spiritual one. They're divided into those three. Now, each one you can divide into two more and go into more details, but in general, they're those three. Yeah. Okay, last question. They're all waiting for you because they want to eat, and you're the barrier now.
God is punishing us.
God is testing everyone.
I remember the question and I had a comment.
Okay.
Just to conclude, the people who wage the war against 10%, they pray, they fast, but none of their prayer or fast is accepted because they're fighting principles of conflict.
Yeah.
So it's like prayer and like when we say substance, it can't be like an outer shell.
Very, very nice point. People that fought the Imam ﷺ were people who were prayer and fasting. They did all that. Still, they killed the Imam, the grandson of the Prophet, which shows that just the mere performance of prayer without substance, to say what you're saying. That's what your point? Beautiful point. Yeah, very good point. That's true. Thank you. Okay. So I guess we'll wrap it up here. We can all fulfill our stomach desires now. And inshallah, use that to improve spiritually as well. Eat in order to give strength. Oh, not yet?
Please? No, sisters first for pizza.
Oh, okay, sorry. Then they'll announce the program. I won't interfere. I guess I should have done. Okay, walhamdulillah rabbil alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.